Reverend Spy by D P Denton. Chapter 9. The next few weeks were comparatively quiet, and Dan was glad that they were. The nightly services at the chapel were important to him, as well as everything else that he was doing, but he never let down his guard against possible slip-ups, and was constantly watching for information that might be fed to 35. He gained the confidence of many of the business and professional men of the city, and became a welcome guest in the city hall. The jail, the railroad terminal, and the transient sleeping quarters maintained by the church groups became a regular source of information on questionable activities, and Dan passed much information on to 35. As a minister, he could visit anywhere he wished without arousing too much suspicion, and his presence, even in the halls of the city's hotels, did not seem unnatural. But even as he sought to turn people to Jesus Christ for spiritual help, he was aiding in the fight for his country. Several valuable leads were passed to 35, and a number of attempted acts of sabotage and spying were broken up before they could be successful. Soon after Dan had moved to B, he began regular visits to a large government hospital nearby. He had been there before as a minister, so now went in a dual role with a blanket pass from the commanding officer. The steady stream of wounded men returning from the front became a double challenge to Dan, and while pointing many of them to God, they gave Dan much valuable information, which he passed on to 35. The best information came from the young officers who had been at the front. There was scarcely a one of them that the enemy had not tried to subvert. Their methods were numerous, but chief among them were three: the use of liquor, whorish women, and homosexual men. Some of the young officers who had served as security men at government installations in the States before going overseas told Dan about rings of women and homosexuals who were being used in the States to hamper defense work and to try to steal our secrets. Much to his surprise, some of these were ministers, and one of them was even a young preacher who had visited in Dan's church in C, and who had visited several times in his home. Looking back on those days, Dan shivered with fear at the thought that on several occasions he had sheltered under his roof as many as 7 enemy agents. Again and again he thanked God for his protection. Based on the information which Dan was able to pass on to 35, several important moves were made. Near the huge and important army center of O, a group of more than 200 women were arrested and put up for long periods of time for operating a ring of harlots for the purpose of destroying the health and morals of our men. In the huge and important development area where Dan was almost trapped and killed in a hotel, a ring of homosexuals was broken up. More than 50 of them were hired and ordered off the area, and several leaders were arrested and imprisoned for using homosexuals to subvert officers and steal information. While Dan's life was free from physical danger during several weeks following his trip north, he was not idle by any means, and 35 later said that it was part of the best work that he did. One Wednesday night, a transient gripped Dan's hand at the door, and the faked but unmistakable voice of 35 said, "Reverend, I need some advice and help. Could you talk with me a few minutes?" Once again, leaving Lori to open the services, Dan escorted a needy soul to the back room for counseling, and 35 lost no time getting down to business. "Could you find an excuse for being in the Southwest over this weekend and come back by bus on Sunday night or Monday?" It took Dan a few minutes to get his mind to working, but then he asked, "How far southwest?" "I think as far as N would do the job," said 35. "Could you arrange it?" Dan answered slowly and thoughtfully, "Well, I do have a brother coming to preach at our services here over the weekend, and there's a little church a few miles out of N that has been after me to visit them for some services. If I could get a phone call like I did before, I might arrange it. I could get some of them to take me into the bus station at N after the service on Sunday night and be there by midnight. Think that would be all right?" "Perfect," beamed 35. "Boy, you always seem to have the answer. Now here is the setup. We have a courier coming from the proving grounds out west. There are always 3 separate couriers who carry these top secret documents, each one only carrying part of the information. Somewhere along the line, we have been losing some of it, and if we lose what is coming this weekend, the enemy might have enough papers to find out what they want to know. Now here's how you will know our man." Quickly, 35 described the courier and the bag he would be carrying, promised to make a fake call to give Dan his invitation for the weekend, handed him a good sum of money, and started for the back door. Then he stopped, turning slowly around and placing his hands on Dan's shoulders, said in a tone which Dan had not heard him use before, "21 plus? Do you want out of this? Are you ready to quit? You've already done enough and several times now have almost paid the full price with your life. You can resign any time you wish. Any trip could be your last one, you know." The agent's solicitude touched Dan's heart, but he brushed aside any feelings of self-concern and said simply, "Sir, when the enemy quits, I'll quit." 35's grip on Dan's shoulders tightened for a moment, and then in a husky voice he whispered, "Thank you." And, turning quickly, he went out into the night. The arrangements were made and Dan was away on Friday. Lori wondered at the suddenness of his plans, but by now had learned to take the surprises as they came. As he went through the city of N, Dan took time to look over the bus terminal and learn the layout of the building. Even as he did so, he was sure that he saw 2 men loitering about that he had seen before during his almost fateful day in the big area. Something in his stomach tightened as he realized again the type of enemy which he was trying to outwit. The weekend services were good. Several folk were converted in the old-fashioned way, and the church urged Dan to return again as soon as possible. Promptly at midnight on Sunday, one of the men of the church deposited him on the sidewalk in front of the terminal at N, shook hands, bade him goodbye, and drove away, leaving him to face unknown dangers alone. It was not long in coming. Strolling through the terminal, Dan picked a seat where he could see both the incoming buses and the crowds inside the waiting room. With his first slow glance around the terminal, he caught his breath, both in surprise and fear. Across the terminal, carefully watching the incoming buses out of the window, were the 2 men he had seen on Friday, and whom he knew now to have been in the big area when he was there. All sense of pleasure left him as he faced the possibility of a confrontation with these dangerous enemy agents. He had no means of defense except his wits and God's protective hand. As far as he knew, neither 35 nor any other bureau men were near. No doubt the courier would not know these men, and of course did not know Dan. Once again he prayed and planned quietly as he waited. The voice on the speaker announced the arrival of a bus from the southwest, and Dan knew in reason that time for care or possible action had arrived. He was as tense as could be as he moved near the entrance and watched for his man. A stream of passengers surged through the doors, and Dan quickly spotted his man and his briefcase. Out of the corner of his eye he saw that the enemy agents had also spotted him, and there began a three-way drama that may have involved both human life and the future of our nation. Across the terminal and into the men's room went 4 men, along with others, and all 4 were interested in the same briefcase. The courier did not know that he was being followed by 2 men, and those 2 men in turn did not know that they were being carefully watched by another. Just before they entered the restroom, Dan noticed something that had escaped him up until this time. Clutched under his topcoat, one of the enemy agents was carrying a briefcase, and from the looks of the other, which was exposed, and the size of the bulge in the topcoat, Dan knew immediately that it was exactly like the one carried by the courier, and in a flash he saw something through the entire system by which the enemy had been securing our secrets from the couriers. Yet it was all so simple that he marveled how it could be. Later he was able to pull all together in his mind and could see how the old switch game could be used in international spying. By using the last change of buses that the couriers had to make, they would be stalking a tired, perhaps sleepy courier who, because of his weariness, would not be as alert as he should be. By having 2 agents work together, it would be much easier, for one of them could create some kind of distraction while the other managed the switch. This was exactly what happened in the restroom, and perhaps would have been successful again had not Dan seen through their game. When the courier entered the room, he went to the end of the line, set his bag and the briefcase down, and entered a booth. Dan knew immediately that this would be where they would try to switch. Sure enough, the biggest of the 2 began to talk loud and boisterously, while the other, with the hidden briefcase, moved unnoticeably toward the courier's baggage. The big man continued to talk loudly and began to ask if anyone in there wanted to fight. All eyes were on him, except those of the other agent and Dan, and the latter hardly knew what to do. 35 had warned him not to reveal himself nor to tackle them alone, and it seemed for a few seconds that he would just have to stand there and watch our secrets be stolen. Then he noticed that there was a window just above the briefcase and could see the lights of cars flashing by on the outside. Quickly he rushed across the room crying, "Hey! What was that just went by?" Immediately all eyes were turned toward Dan, and also toward the precious briefcase, for Dan had placed 1 foot on each side of it and was stretching up to get a better look outside. Others came over to have a look, and in the confusion and crowd, a scowling, mad enemy agent backed away. As the courier emerged from the booth, Dan glanced toward the door and saw the 2 agents leave the restroom, but he knew their little game was just begun. "I'm sorry, sir," he spoke politely to the courier, "to have parked across your baggage, but I wanted to try and see something that was going down the street." The courier looked frightened for a moment, then muttered something, and he moved over to the lavatory to wash. As he saw him once again moving away from the precious briefcase, seemingly so tired that he did not remember to be careful, a desperate plan was born in Dan's mind, and he acted at once. quickly going across the room, he picked up the one large bag that he carried with him. Entering a booth and latching the door, he sat the bag on the commode seat and opened it. For ease in carrying, he had put his own briefcase inside the big bag, and now he got it out. It was not as nice as the one carried by the courier, not quite like it, but it was about the same size and color, and Dan determined to take the risk of not being discovered. He knew if he failed, he might end up in jail, accused of trying to steal government secrets. Quickly emptying his Bible and papers into the big bag, he crammed a dirty shirt and other items into the briefcase so as to make it about the same size as the courier's, and then opened the booth and stepped out. The enemy agents had not come back, but the room was pretty full, and the courier was still washing and refreshing himself. Nonchalantly moving over to where the precious briefcase and other bag sat, Dan set his down near them, stretched as though he was trying to wake up, and noticing that the closest booth was latched. He tried the door, but of course could not get in. As though unable to wait, he walked over, picked up his bag and a briefcase, and left the room. All he could do was to hope that neither the courier nor the agents would see the difference, for he had played the old switch game himself, and now carried a briefcase that held some of the top secrets of World War II. Just outside the restroom was a stack of lockers, and finding an empty one, he quickly shoved his briefcase in and locked the door. Making a mental note of the locker number, he slipped the key into his shoe, working it down under the ball of his foot. When he walked through the waiting room again, he was once again the innocent preacher returning from a weekend meeting in the country. They might have discovered that the case was gone, and they might even think that he was responsible, but they would have a hard time finding those secrets. In fact, if they shot me, he grinned inwardly, they still would not have the briefcase, and when the undertaker finds the key in my shoe, he will naturally turn it over to the police. Not much comfort there, he thought, but laughed at the idea. Across the terminal, two men whispered to one another as they watched the restroom door. Taking a seat again, Dan thought the situation over. Only half of his job was done. The secrets were safe. He knew how the others had been stolen from the couriers, but he still had no proof on the agents and did not know how to get it. Perhaps, he thought, I had better call for help. 35 had given him a number in N to use in case of emergency, and he felt that the time had come to use it. Moving to a line of phone booths across the station from the enemies, he sought one at the end of the line for more privacy. To his satisfaction, when he had closed the door, he discovered that he could see both the restroom door and the enemy agents. Giving the operator the number, he waited for the response. At the sound of the crisp voice identifying the number as that of the local bureau, he said, "This is 21 plus. 35 told me to call you if I needed help." And he could almost feel the tension on the other end of the line. Almost instantly, another voice came on and said, "Yes, 21 plus, what can we do for you?" Quickly, Dan gave him his location, the phone booth he was in, the number of the locker in which the precious briefcase was locked, and he told them where the key was hidden. "Whew," said the bureau man. "You sure work fast. We have 2 men there now. They have seen the courier and are suspicious of 2 men that are there, but they haven't identified you, and sure let you put one over on them. Now what? Tell me what comes next, and they'll have the word in less than 5 minutes. Dan breathed a sigh of relief. "I'm sure glad to hear that. The bus to the area leaves in about 30 minutes, and the courier will get on it. Those fellows will have to make the switch before then, and they're getting desperate." Tell your men to keep their eye on the two characters in the northwest corner of the terminal and the courier. I'll be ready to help if I can. If they make a switch, your men can take them, and the evidence is in the locker. Say, here comes the courier now, and he is looking this way as though he wants to use the phone. I'll hang up now. Oh yes, tell your men I want my briefcase back. I'd never be able to explain to my wife what happened to it. Dan backed as far back into the corner of the booth as possible, and was partly hidden from view. From this vantage point, he witnessed one of the most dramatic scenes that one could ever see, and one that he could never forget. The courier took the phone booth next to the one in which Dan was concealed, and set his bag and Dan's briefcase down outside. When he had come out of the restroom, the two enemy agents had separated, one going one direction and one the other, but slowly making their way toward the courier. It was plain that they intended to do something, even if it had to be a desperate move. When the courier set the bags down and entered the phone booth, a knowing look passed between the two, and they approached more rapidly. Dan watched it all as if he had a ringside seat to a staged performance. He saw the briefcase come out from under the agent's topcoat. He saw the two men meet in front of the booth, the one between the briefcase and the courier so as to block his view. He saw the one with the briefcase feign a perfect stumble and fall right between the courier's bags. He saw the other one stop and help him up as though they were strangers. And he also saw that in the confusion, the switch had been made, and the enemy had what he thought was the more precious secrets. Dan almost laughed as he thought of the surprise that awaited them. He saw them shake hands and heard one thank the other for helping him up off the floor. Then he saw them part and start to leave, and his heart sank. Where were the bureau men? Why hadn't they arrived? How could he possibly stop them? But his worries were all in vain. When the two men were so far apart that they could not act together, each of them was stopped by two bureau men for questioning. He saw the one with the bag try to run, only to be stopped at the door by two other bureau men. He saw the other one try to go for his pocket, and marveled at the swiftness with which he was subdued. It all happened so fast that very few of the people knew that anything unusual was taking place, and none of them knew what it meant. When they had gone out the door, Dan moved out of his booth, slumped in a seat, and sat there shaken, but extremely grateful for the protection of God and the efficiency of the Bureau. Once again, he had been in a situation where he might have been killed, but once again he had been spared, and once again he had been able to successfully fulfill an assignment. When his bus was announced, Dan joined the line of boarders and slowly moved toward the door. When he handed his ticket to the driver handed back his punch ticket and a baggage check. A gentleman checked your briefcase and told me to see that you got the check. With a thank you, Dan moved on to the bus, found a seat by himself, and sank into a relaxed sleep. He had completed another weekend as a visiting preacher in a strange place, and at the same time, he had done something worthwhile for his country. At the last stop, which the bus made before reaching B, Dan looked up to see 35 coming on board, and moved over to make a seat for him by his side. "Well, mister," he beamed at Dan almost as soon as he sat down, "what have you been up to now?" As if he didn't know already. "I've been hiding in a phone booth trying to keep from being seen." "So, that's where you were," laughed 35. "Wait till I tell the fellows at N. They caught the enemy agents and are escorting the courier back to the area to be dismissed, but said they never did spot you, and they're wondering now if I have a spook on my staff. I'm sure they were too busy to look for me, and if they hadn't been there on the job, I probably would be a spook or something by now. 35, it has to be God who is helping us. Well, I'm glad he is on our side, came the reply as the bus pulled into B. Now, young fellow, we have much to do, but for a while I want you to stay at home. Carry on your services and allay any suspicions anyone might have. Let me know when you have any trips to make. We might want you to catch a spy or two for us on your way. Seriously, 21 plus, Mr. Big is as curious over you as he can be. Do you realize that you have caught 3 of their top agents on your last 2 trips? That batting more than 100%. 35, Dan said slowly. If God had given me justice, I would be in hell now. If my country had given me justice years ago, I would have been in jail. Now, I want to do all I can for both of them. The passengers began to leave the bus, and Dan deliberately waited until 35 was gone before he moved out with the last of them. No local people must ever see them together, especially Lori and the boys. A grateful preacher made his way home and threw himself wholeheartedly into his work. He did not know how soon he would be called on again to face the enemy. Daily, he thanked God for Lori, who trusted him without asking too many questions. But it was not to be long until more mysteries were added to his actions.